Hi, everyone. My name is Justine from We Work Remotely, and today we have a webinar on creating your ideal remote workflow, which will be led by Emma Murray, who is the content manager at Toggl. If you haven't heard of Toggl, be sure to check them out. They're actually my go-to time tracking app. I'm a big fan of them. So after Emma's presentation, which will be about 30-ish minutes,
40-ish, yeah.
40-ish minutes, awesome. We'll have time for to take some of your questions. So feel free to engage with us and everyone here who's joining in the chat, and to add your questions in the Q&A box here that you can find at the bottom panel here. So yeah, without further ado, Emma, I'll just hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. Okay, that's working. Cool. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. This talk is about how to design your perfect remote day. So I am just gonna do a quick intro to me. I work for Toggl, as you know. So I work as a content manager there, and I've been there for the last 3.5 years. In terms of working remotely, I've been remote for about 6 years at this point. I've barely worked in an office even, so really into the remote. Yeah. Other than that, I've worked in tech for quite a while and was a freelancer at some point. So I'm pretty experienced in having to manage your own time. And now my work at Toggl, I do a lot of research and writing about remote work as well as productivity and topics around that. So how to design your perfect remote workday. So I'm actually going to start with what I am not going to be talking about. So there's a million things you can do to make working from home a more pleasant, productive, and efficient experience. Everything from, adding certain plants in to making sure your workstation is set up right. And those can be really important, especially things like the ergonomics of your setup. But they're not really what I want to get into today. And I don't really want to talk about, the different ways you can plan your day, or like whether or not the right way to do it is to wake up at 7 or 8 or 5, or like your best morning routines or whatever. Like those are all interesting and good, but I find that there's a bit too much focus on those as the main thing. I think you need to sort of look at it as a structural thing first, and then deal with, those specific things. So I'm not going to talk about wearing pants. Wear whatever pants you want. Doesn't matter. As long as you're not pantsless on a webcam, then you're good. Not going to talk about buying things. There's a lot of, gear lists of like your remote work setup. Those are great. If you Google it, you'll probably come up with some good stuff. Not going to talk about one-size-fits-all solutions because I don't really believe in them. I think that most people will adapt and do things differently and figure out their own way, but you need to give the background to allow people to implement their own adaptations on stuff. That and hacks, I don't think those really work in the long term. So my main goal is I want to guide you through a way of thinking and approaching your own remote work that will enable you to better make these sorts of choices on your own. So what I will be talking about, my main focus is the behavioral component of remote work, as well as some of the big issues that surround it. So how to structure and modify our behaviors and thoughts to create a better work from home experience. So a perfect remote work day. My agenda for this is, first, we're going to define what we want from a remote work day. Then we're going to look at 3 fundamentals that every remote workday must have. And lastly, we're going to look at approaches in designing and iterating on your own remote workday. So let's get into it. What do you want from a remote workday? Most of us kind of want the same things: to do professionally and personally satisfying work, to leave work feeling energized. You want to feel good at the end of your day. You want to take advantage of the flexibility, or else, why would you work remotely if you didn't? And we all want to be free of guilt or worry at the end of our workday. So what stops us from having that perfect remote workday? Well, there's bad and ill-equipped work environments. So if you're sent home to work remotely with the wrong tools, that can be a bad thing. If you're always expected to be online and available, that's also not a good thing. If you have a toxic work environment in the office and then you're set to work remotely, it's still going to be toxic. It's just going to be toxic in a different way. Or maybe your job is just not what you want it to be. Working remotely won't solve any of those. So those can all impact it. You've also got external factors. That's a big thing nowadays. You have things like, you can't get childcare, and if you can't have any sort of break from that, then it's pretty hard to have a productive and healthy work day. If there's literally no quiet places in your house, that also makes it pretty difficult. So those are two big sort of things. And then the last thing, which is the main focus that I'm going to look at, is ourselves. And this is the easiest thing to control. If you feel like, maybe there's a combination of these things, you can first, deal with the you part of the remote work and then expand and be like, oh, okay, I now have these good habits, but I don't feel like my remote work day is good. Could it be because I'm not in the right work environment, or like I have this external factor or whatever? So my main focus is you structuring your own work day to get the most out of it. Cool. So let's go into the 3 things that every remote work day has. So when you really boil it down, every remote work day, basically, no matter your position or job, has 3 sort of core elements. It has structure. And when I say structure, I mean there is a beginning and an end to your workday. It's productive. You're able to accomplish your work and feel personally accomplished by doing so. And it's sustainable, so it can be reproduced or maintained over time. So, you've got this little graph, which it sort of shows a little bit how they're all interwoven. If you have structure and you have sustainability without productivity, then you're not going to be getting stuff done, and eventually you'll probably be let go. And same with the others, they all intersect, but it's not really as neat as it is here. Most of these things are built one on top of another. So, if one collapses, they all will. So if, you have structure and sustainability and you're not getting stuff done, that's not actually sustainable in the long term. So, yeah. So let's deal with structure first. So, structure. Every workday needs a beginning and an end. This is the most important part of structure, and I think it's a part of structure that people really let go of. But it is extremely important. So why? The need for recovery is a fundamental part of both personal satisfaction and your actual job performance. So let's look at this from a little bit of a different angle. So in medical or physiological terms, what happens when we go to work is our bodies go through something called the effort recovery model. So by going through our regular work tasks, which require expanded efforts, our bodies react to this by accelerating our heart rate, elevating our blood pressure, and increasing fatigue. And then once we're experiencing all of these things, our body then has to regulate all of these factors. And so our bodies have coping mechanisms to deal with this. And it doesn't matter if you're like crazy stressed out, like just the event of going to work will cause all of these things to happen. But in periods of higher stress, you also have your body releasing cortisol as an additional control. So that's a stress hormone. So your body has this effect recovery model. Under optimal circumstances, these physiological reactions, they're all going to return to their base levels during after work hour. So you're going to be able to recover and feel good again before you start work and your health isn't at risk. That's sort of, the best case scenario. But if after work, or you don't have an after work, you won't be able to have that recovery period that you need to control all of these factors. So the stress related reactions continue to reoccur after work hours, and your body isn't able to recover. So when you start to work again, your body needs to invest even more effort to perform. And these effects compound. So you're going to just have to keep putting in more and more effort, and you're just going to keep experiencing more of these symptoms. So recovery is extremely important, both in terms of the physiological impact, but also there's other studies that show the importance of recovery. So there was a 2012 study that found the more recovered an employee is in the morning, the more engaged the employee will be during the day in their work. And then also the predicted recovery at night also ends up being greater because of these things. So recovery is important, but it's also one of the most difficult things for remote workers to do. So Buffer did a study in 2019, or not a study, a survey, and they found that unplugging after work was listed as the top struggle of working remotely. And that's partially because it's a difficult thing for most people to do, more or less, wherever you work. It's hard to unplug. We have our phones on us all the time. But there are also particular aspects of remote work that make this specific thing a lot harder. So there was research done at the MIT Sloan School of Business that found 3 main reasons that remote employees struggled with work-life balance and recovery. So these were the 3 main reasons. They were lack of traditional boundaries, the psychological demands, and the nature of remote work itself. So I'm going to deal with the first two, not really going to talk about the third. So lack of boundaries. Let's break this down a little bit. Working from home really doesn't have any enforced boundaries most of the time. It's like, do you work from home or do you sleep at work? Like, what does working from home even mean anymore in 2020? Like, where are these boundaries? So these same researchers identified 3 main types of boundaries that remote workers lacked. They were spatial, temporal, and social, or, alternatively known, you've got the space you're working in, the time your work takes, and the people in your environment. So I'm not really going to talk so much about the people, but the space and the time are extremely big things. So you need to create space boundaries. There's a few pieces of advice that I hear over and over again around space boundaries, and they're good advice. But personally, I find them a bit frustrating because they tend to require a decent financial commitment. And I also don't think they're a silver bullet for the problem. So the main one there is having a separate office. So if you have space to have a separate office, go for it. But if you don't have space to have it, don't worry about it. And even if you do set up a separate office, there's actually a chance you're going to come up against the problem of novelty eventually, because we engage with our surroundings that, we find novel, and over time it sort of wears down. So you really need variation. But if you're in your home office, every day, all day for 4 years, then eventually you're really going to just need a new environment. So other than setting up an office in your house, how do you create a spatial boundary? The other thing that people talk about a lot is creating a designated workspace, which is also good. I do that. I would recommend doing that, pull out an office chair, set up a little table or something in a corner, or like have a place at your table that you sit that you've decided is your office, or buy a desk or whatever. I would definitely recommend that, but I would also combine it with other space creating strategies. So simulating a commute. This one might seem counterintuitive, especially if you're a new remote worker whose main joy in remote work is the lack of commute. And I'm not suggesting that you get in your car and do a 30-minute drive around your neighborhood. But the act of physically moving can help bookend your day. So I would, take one day, just do it, give it a try, see if it helps you a little bit. You don't have to do it every day. I don't do it every day. But having, a period and a time when you get away from your computer, you get away ideally from your house, can help create a spatial boundary. And actually, when researchers were looking into commutes, they found that the ideal commute for most people isn't 0 minutes. It's actually 16 minutes. So there was a study done in 2001 that they surveyed about 1,300 workers in the San Francisco area to report their actual and their ideal commute times. The researchers found that the average one-way ideal time was 16 minutes. And this also has been corroborated by other studies that people actually enjoy some form of like mental turning off both before and after work. There was an urban planner and author, Charles Montgomery, who sort of built upon this research, and he noted that people who they had the most pleasant commuting experience were those people who walked or biked to work. And this tracks with health studies that report people who spend more time, doing activities and stuff tend to report better moods. So you might want to give yourself a commute, even if it feels a little bit silly. Another option would be going to external spaces, such as co-working spaces and cafes. And nowadays, this might not be possible. It really depends where you live. And it also has an associated cost. But if you were to ask me if you're going to spend money on a dedicated office space or co-working, I'd 100% recommend co-working. Mostly because you get the mental benefits of a commute. You get socialization, which is another really big issue for remote work in general. And then you get the option of novelty. So when your home starts to look too familiar, you're able to actually switch it up. So now that you've sort of got an idea of how to create a space boundary, let's talk about time boundaries. So temporal boundaries. These are one of the hardest things to deal with because they are the first thing we all make exceptions to. You're like, I'll check my email before bed. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't impact me. I actually like being connected. It's like, no, stop. So many people think this doesn't apply to me. They think I'm not stressed out by this. And that could very well be true in the short term. You might feel completely fine. But humans aren't particularly good at identifying our own feelings. You can be building out tension without actually really knowing it. And at some point it will come out. Like it could be 6 months, it could be 10 years. There's no knowing when it will come out, but I can guarantee you at some point that will wear you down. Plus, it will not, you will not be able to mentally recover and have that important recovery time. So this particularly applies if you are a manager, even doubly applies, because if you specify that you don't expect people to respond to an email or Slack message after hours, but you're setting an unspoken precedent by responding to email and Slack after these set hours, there's going to be pressure for your team to respond. It doesn't really matter what you say, your team is going to match your actions. So really your actions are much more important than your words in this case. So how can you set boundaries in these areas? There's a lot of different ways to do it, but my recommendation would be to start more drastic than you think you require. It's not like haircutting where, you cut off a big chunk and then you're like, oh no, what have I done? I can't add it back. You don't start with a little bit and add up. I would start with the big thing and then work your way down as you have habits formed. Because a lot of these things are a lot harder to quit than you actually think they are. So if given a nuclear option or like a tiny change, go for the nuclear one and then make the tiny change later once you've developed a good habit. So a big thing for time boundaries is segmenting your technology. And because it's remote work, a lot of these are going to be technological, and they're going to have to deal with your own behavior. A caveat to this is these are not going to work if your boss or clients or coworkers are the reasons that you're not able to separate your time. Those issues would require conversations with those people about boundary setting. Yeah, so if your boss expects you to respond to an email at 9 p.m. and you are, done work at 5, then that isn't really a you problem. That's more that office or, work environment problem that we talked about before. So yeah, back to separating work technology from life technology. The most expensive way to do this would be getting a separate computer, phone, etc. But again, like the home office, it's not necessary. Some workplaces might, provide you with your own computer or, your own phone or what have you. But if they don't, there's a few things you can do. So one would be create a separate work user on your computer. So for example, I've got a personal computer that I use for personal and work. So I've got 2 users. One is for Toggl and one is for Emma. So that way, when I'm on Toggl, I'm not distracted by personal things or folders or notifications or apps at all. And if you have things you need to transfer between those 2 users, you can set up a shared folder, or what I do is I just have a cloud folder that I keep most things in, particularly a lot of work things. So that way I can just easily transfer between the 2. And when I've logged out of Toggl, I'm out of Toggl. Like, I'm not looking at anything. Another thing I can highly recommend would be setting up different users in your browser. So I can only really speak to the ability of Google Chrome to do this, though I'm sort of assuming the other major browsers also have similar things. If you set up different users, it's going to allow you to have different bookmarks, which for me is a really big thing, because that way I don't have like any indication of stuff that would normally distract me. And the other big thing is you don't have like an autofill on Google, or you also probably won't have things logged in. So, in your work version of Google Chrome, you can be not logged into Instagram or logged into Facebook or not logged into anything that will really distract you. So that often will just like, if you need to navigate off the page or you find yourself like drifting away from work and you're like, oh, I want to look at Facebook, often just hitting the sign up page will just make you go, oh, wait, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, I got to get back to work. So I would highly recommend splitting up your browser into 2 different users. When it comes to your phone and emails, I would also recommend getting 2 separate apps for email, because you don't want to be checking your personal email and then like stumble upon a work thing, because even if you just see it, you're automatically going to have like this mental shift of like, oh, work, like, oh, do I need to respond to it? Or like, should I not? Or you'll just respond to it, which means you're having no boundary and you've been into that recovery time. So I would recommend having 2 emails if you have to have your email on your phone. Maybe just don't have your email on your phone. Like, do people really need to reach you that badly? Like, maybe not. So yeah, would definitely recommend that. So talking a bit more about your phone, I would also recommend not having Slack on your phone. If you use Slack or like Google Chat or whatever other chat things, delete them off your phone. You don't need them. Like, people can wait. A big thing for me when I had a conversation with our HR manager, and she was like, why do you have Slack on your phone? And I was like, well, like sometimes in the middle of the day, I'll go to the grocery store and like, I don't want to be offline. Like, I don't want people to not be able to reach me. And she was like, what could possibly be like that urgent that someone can't wait 15 minutes for you? And I was like, yeah, actually, you're probably right. So, don't multitask. Like, if you take time in the middle of the day to do another task, say like grocery shopping, like do that task and just that task. Those breaks are like a big reason a lot of us want to work remotely. We want to be able to do these life things and, not split our focus. And that is also just recuperating time. It gives your brain a break from your immediate stimulation of like these notifications. So it is okay to step away from Slack and not necessarily respond instantly to people. But one thing is you need to communicate those boundaries to your coworkers and your bosses and clients and whoever. Most people won't be upset as long as they know when you're going to respond. So at Toggl, we have like a 24-hour policy. Generally, I will get back to people before 24 hours, but they know that within 24 hours, they can expect a response from me. So letting your coworkers and your boss and everyone know when they can get back to you, and also when you won't be looking, like, setting those strict hours, being like after 6 p.m., I won't be responding to anything whatsoever. So that gets into setting expectations, which is just, letting people know how you respond and when you're going to respond, and making sure it's sort of okay for everyone. Yeah. The last thing is committing to calling it quits. So when it comes to calling it an end of a day, this is something a lot of people really struggle with. And there's a lot of advice out there that says quit when everything is done, no matter when that is. I am extremely against that for a number of reasons. First reason is Parkinson's law, which says that work will expand to fill the time given. So if you give work forever, it'll take forever. The second is another finding about recovery. So you're more likely to feel a greater sense of recovery when you quit before your energy resources are depleted. So there was a quote attributed to Ernest Hemingway that said, what was it? It was like your mind will subconsciously work on the task that you quit on until you start the following day. So if you quit at a point where you're struggling, you might end up, thinking about that, making it a lot more difficult to get started the next day. So, quit while you're ahead is some pretty good advice. And then the third reason that you gotta commit to calling it quits is feelings of guilt, which I'm actually going to get into a little bit more in the next bit, which is about productivity. So this is the second element of a good remote workday. No matter what work you do, there should be some element of it that's fulfilling. People tend to work better when they feel like they've been more productive during the day. You also need to fulfill the professional requirements of your job. So being productive lets you get work done. And when it comes to productivity, there's a million different things I could talk about. You've got like methods and approaches and ideas and what have you. And I'll mention a few. But there's a few parts of productivity that are unique to remote work and deal less with the specific tasks and more with the overall productivity of a remote workday. So remote productivity can sort of be broken into two sections. There's focus and demands. So let's actually go back to the slide where I was talking about the research from the MIT Sloan School. It was the one that identified 3 main reasons that remote employees struggled with work-life balance and recovery. So if you remember that, it was the lack of traditional boundaries that we've talked about. And then second, we've got the psychological demands. So these aren't the external demands of your job, but rather they're the demands you place on yourself. And a lot of the time we place these demands on ourselves because we want to compensate for lack of visibility and role ambiguity that tends to exist within remote work. So this is a quote from the study. It says, many remote employees, especially those who are members of global teams, feel a greater need to prove themselves by putting in longer hours and being available beyond people's expectations, which adds to the stress. So let's think about this in terms of a graph. What would a perfect remote work day look like? So we've got this graph here. We've got the start and end boundaries we talked about. We've got recovery marked out there. So, if you follow the line at the beginning, you've got pretty productive. It takes you a little bit to get up there, but you get up there. You've got some waves. Those are sort of your breaks. And then you end your workday when you're still pretty productive. You're less productive than you were when you first started, but that's the nature of work. Now, let's look at a remote work day when you're trying to compensate for those psychological demands that we just discussed. So you're going along as usual. You've got your recovery, your start of the workday, and then you start to think about packing it in for the day. And that's when you start to feel guilt over feeling like you didn't really do enough. So our emotions and our productivity are pretty strongly connected. So because you feel that guilt, all of a sudden your productivity, drops even more. And so you're getting into this overcompensation zone where you're doing, longer amount of work, but it's quite a bit lower productivity than the rest of your day. And then you're ending your day a lot later because you're overcompensating and you're not getting that recovery. So, this is day one of feeling these feelings. Now let's go to day two. So this is this day after. Now you see that the less recovery that exists there, it's compounded. So you start your workday with feeling less good. Because of that, your productivity at the very beginning is lower. And so you go along and eventually you might feel guilty over the fact that, when you started your workday, your productivity was already lower. And then you've still got that same guilt of like, oh, I feel like I didn't do enough. I feel like I didn't do very much work. And so then you have another drop and then your overcompensation zone gets bigger and your productivity falls even more. So if you continue in this cycle, you're not going to be fulfilling the obligations of your job. You're not going to feel particularly great about your job because, you're not doing very well. And then you're also not getting any recovery, which is going to, continue making you feel bad. So getting stuck in this cycle is a really, really good way to all of a sudden just hate remote work. And this is a pretty common cycle. Like I've been in this cycle. I think a lot of people, maybe almost everyone who does remote work at some time has like ended up here. So how do we avoid that? So a good way to avoid that guilt and that desire to overcompensate is keeping a record of your task and your time. So by keeping a record, you'll get a visualization of what you actually did during the day. And this is useful both for your own purposes and then your employer's purposes, because if you can easily share a list of what you've done today or like a report or what have you, it'll show them that you're not, shirking your duties by any means. You're actually getting the stuff that you needed to get done. But it also gives you permission to quit. You can go back and be like, oh, I did A and B and C, and it shows you yourself that you're getting stuff done. So yeah, even if you're working, fewer hours or what have you than you normally put in the office, you can look at it and be like, wait, yeah, I only worked like 7 hours or 6 hours, but like actually that's like more than I would have done in the office. So like, great, I'm becoming more efficient because I work from home. Like, fantastic. So how can you keep a record of this? A good way to keep a record of this is with Toggl. So this is unsurprising, but I would recommend using Toggl. And this is, for example, I think my week last week or 2 weeks ago. I don't know what time is anymore. So tracking this way is really convenient because you're able to compare it with, your historical data. So maybe on Wednesday you hit a productivity plateau like I did. And you have the option of either being like, oh, I'm gonna like really power through it and like try and get stuff done or what have you, or you could look back and be like, actually on Tuesday, like I worked quite a bit and like I really did get a lot of stuff done, and like I really hope on Thursday with this additional recovery I'll also get like a lot of stuff done, which is exactly what happened. So you can give yourself permission to like take that and be like, you know what, recovery is going to be better for my productivity overall versus like putting in this extra 2 hours or what have you. So instead of feeling guilty, you can feel good and use that time for genuine recovery. In terms of Toggl, like if you want to keep track of your own stuff, we've got a free plan and it'll do you really, really well. I would recommend just signing up and giving it a shot. So moving on back to this productivity of, we've got the demands and focus. So we've dealt with those psychological demands. Let's deal with focus now. So this is a big one. This is like where the productivity industry likes to really, really like sink in. So there's a ton of different hacks and methods and what have you. Like a while ago, I counted some up and I think I came up with like 50 different ways of like balancing things or like getting things done. And that doesn't even include the variations of like, working from like 9 to 7 for 4 days and then taking one day off, or like, only working 6 hours every week. Like there is just tons of stuff out there. And so if you're in a position where you've already dealt with, giving your day a beginning and an end, you're getting a good recovery and you're not putting these psychological demands on yourself, the focus bit is already going to be a lot easier. So in terms of keeping focused, the big thing is really just finding something that works for you. So instead of telling you a system or approach that's going to be best, I instead want to give you a little bit more information about how our brains work, so that you can, figure out what system will actually be the best for you. So, BRAC. This stands for Basic Rest Activity Cycle. And this was discovered about 50 years ago. There's a sleep researcher who found that during sleep, we went through 5 stages from light to deep and then out again. But he also found that our bodies go through the same cycle during the day. So when we're awake, we move from higher to lower alertness about every 90 minutes. So after working at high intensity for more than 90 minutes, we begin to draw on these emergency reserves of energy to keep us going. And these findings were also supported by a 1993 study of violinists that found that the best ones all practice the same way. So it was in the morning, in 3 increments of no more than 90 minutes each, with a break between each one. And the person who ran the study also found the same pattern among musicians, athletes, chess players, and writers. So take this with a grain of salt. These findings aren't always applicable to every kind of work or profession out there. And with studies like this, there's a lot of external factors that can impact results that we might not be thinking or talking about. But this generally does support the idea that time blocking in some way, shape, or form can help keep us focused. So there's a lot of ways to do time blocking. I'm just going to talk about what I do personally. So I set a timer for a period of time. It's generally about 50 or 90 minutes, and I work on one project for that time. So I do this both with Toggl and my phone. So that's a screenshot of my Toggl desk app over there. And so I set it to run for 90 minutes and tell me when I'm done. And then I take a 30-minute break, and I'll also set alarms on my phone. I'll also do this, I'll completely block out distractions for that period of time. So no multitasking, anything on my computer that will take away attention from a project like Slack or email, I just close out completely. If there's websites that I'm getting distracted at, if I feel like I'm going to go to like Instagram or whatever, I'll just like block them with an app called Self-Control that I'll link all of these things. I've got some resources that I'm going to provide you with at the end. So that's what I will tend to do. And that actually leads pretty well into the next point, which is when it comes to distractions, a lot of people say eliminate distractions as much as possible, which is good advice. But if you don't have a good attention span, even if you eliminate all the distractions in your house, it's perfectly clean, you get rid of your TV, you'll still find ways to distract yourself. So no matter what, you're going to need to build your attention span. There's a bunch of ways to do that. I'm not really going to get into them. We don't have enough time. But I will provide a link to an article that has some options. But the time blocking we talked about before is going to give you a good start on improving that attention span. So that actually brings us really nicely into the last element every remote work day should have, and that is sustainability. It can be maintained over the long term. So everything we've talked about so far contributes to sustainability. When it comes to the specifics of sustainability, the biggest thing is going to be, or not the biggest thing, but the most obvious thing is going to be habits. So to build all of the practices we've mentioned thus far in your day-to-day work, they need to become habits. There isn't a specific number of days it takes for something to become a habit, but a study in the European Journal of Social Psychology found it takes more than 2 months for a new behavior to become a habit. They found it was 66 days for them, but that was also an average. Like for some people, it took 18 days. For some people, it took 254. I think that was the top limit of that. So you really do have to stick with these things and give them enough time before they become automatic. So I feel like that leads into the next thing, which is really don't beat yourself up if you fail at these. It can take a while. Hopefully it won't take you 254 days, but you never know. So the last and probably most important part in terms of sustainability is your work has to be emotionally sustainable. So if you're mentally not in a good place, no amount of structure is going to make it better. And eventually, the emotional turbulence is going to bring down a lot of the progress that you made. A lot of findings on productivity show that emotions and, productivity are connected. So there is a study that was done that had research participants read sad stories to put them in distressed emotional states. And participants knew they had an intelligence test coming up, but their distress made them inclined to procrastinate with enjoyable activities like puzzles or video games. So the implication there is that when people are upset, they indulge themselves in impulses that make them feel better. So, if you're not emotionally great, it's going to be a lot harder to not procrastinate or not, have a sense of focus. And there was actually, similarly other types of research on procrastination that found that there was sort of two types of procrastinators. You've got, I believe it's about 80% of the population are sort of, garden variety procrastinators. It's me, it's probably you. You put stuff off if you don't really want to do it. But then there's the other 20% who are chronic procrastinators, which means they don't just procrastinate on the things they don't want to do, even enjoyable things they procrastinate on, or general life things. So there's a doctor named Joseph R. Ferrari, who's the main researcher on this. And he found that it primarily comes from self-esteem issues, worrying over lack of ability and the fear of failure. And his research showed that the only effective way to deal with it is, therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. So, for those people, you can try and do as much time blocking or other strategies as you want, but it's just not going to stick. So you really do need to be in a good place mentally to make these things really work over the long term. It'll make everything super difficult if you're not. So it's important to take care of that aspect of your life, whether it's through, socialization, things like meditation, activities, hobbies, therapy, maybe all of the above. That'll definitely put you in a place where remote work is going to be a lot better of a long-term option for you. So yeah, those are the three main things. So here's a quick summary, just going over what we talked about. You got your day as a beginning and an end. You do not touch work after work, and you get tasks done. So I'm going to quickly speed through the last bit, which is how can you design your own remote workday? So this is sort of a framework for you to start thinking about, making those smaller modifications of what productivity strategy should I implement? Should I time block in 50-minute portions, or like, do I do a Pomodoro method of like 25 minutes, 5 minutes off? So the first thing you should probably do, or the first thing that I did, is define the problem. So when I was thinking about this, of like, how would I go about designing my own perfect workday, I decided to use a design thinking framework more because it suits my personal style. And the first step in that is empathy. So it's hard to be honest with yourself if you're beating yourself up about your problems. So you need to, not equate any of the problems you list when you're defining the problem as failures. You really need to be empathetic. Like, remote work is hard for everyone. Like, that's just what it is. So I ran myself through this exercise, and a few that I came up with were like, I don't feel like I'm ever off and I find it difficult to relax, or I'm not able to focus for very long. Another one was like, I feel physically bleh by the time I'm done work. So I made a list of problems, and then you want to narrow it down. Don't focus on all of the problems, just pick one you think you can tackle. And then the next step is research. So come up with a few options, do a little bit of research into how other people have been solving it. Make a list of 1 or 2 or maybe 3 things that you want to try, and then decide on those options. And then you want to incorporate it into your day. And you want to make sure you're giving it time to make sure it fits with your style of working. So third step is, implementing it. So I don't know, choose a period to do it, like say 2 weeks. I wouldn't do just 1 day because I don't think that's going to be enough. I would give it a proper amount of time before, nixing it. So you implement, and then you want to track your progress. So you can track either qualitative or quantitative or both. So let's take that focus problem. What I was going to do, or what I did, was starting to track my work periods with Toggl. So I wanted to see, if I could work for longer without getting distracted. But another thing is I wanted to see if my mood might impact it. So in Toggl, in the descriptions box or in the tags, I could go back and add, specific tags about like how I was feeling when it happened. So like an example of that, I've got this presentation, and I noted that I felt sleepy when I was working on it. So that way, once I get to the next stage, which is evaluation, I can look at it and be like, oh wait, I was sleepy every single time that I had a really bad work thing. Maybe it's not that I can't focus. Maybe it's just that I need to like really work on my sleep hygiene. So yeah, you can track it, you go back, you look at it, and then once you've evaluated, you want to repeat. So you want to see if the method has made a difference, but you also want to keep trying new things. So the unfortunate truth about remote work is that almost all of us are going to have to keep modifying and adjusting our approaches. Life changes, the world changes. We're going to have to just try new things. What could have worked for you for 6 months or a year or 5 years could all of a sudden just not work very well for you. I've been doing this for almost 6 years, and I'm in a place where I'm still adjusting and tweaking my approach. And some days there will be approaches where, or there will be days where just like your approaches don't really work. And that's fine. This is an iterative process. Like, we're all constantly learning. So, keep going and try things out and keep repeating this process to figure out what works for you. And that's it. So yeah, I can turn it over for Q&A. I've also got some further reading and some sources available at this link if you want to take that down, or I can send it out in the chat. That will have anything that I've mentioned that is a study is in there, and any additional resources are also in there.
Wow, fantastic. That was such a helpful presentation there. I think it's so validating to hear not that I want other people to struggle, obviously, but it's always validating to hear that, what I'm facing or whoever's facing is actually a common thing. I remember when I started working remotely, which, by the way, please if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box there. I see one from Deo there. I'll get to it in a second there. But I just wanted to mention that when I first started working remotely, I remember time would just go by and I'm like, what did I even just do? Like my notion of what work was like completely shifted from working in an office in person to working at home by myself. And I actually used Toggl, and this isn't actually like a plug that's whatever, but it is my personal plug that I actually used Toggl to reflect back what I actually worked on and to show me how productive I was. So totally, it totally works. At least it worked for me. Okay, so if you're ready, let's get to some of these questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
So this is a good one from Deo. Whenever I see a message from my product manager after work, I always feel guilty for ignoring it until the next day. Is that wrong? Will not replying immediately affect work security?
I mean, that really depends on your individual workplace. I think a big thing with that is really having open and honest conversation with your product manager, being like, oh, what are the expectation in terms of messaging for me? Because you can't really say whether or not it's going to hurt you or help you without really knowing what they're thinking. Some places it could. There are some places that have a really high expectation that everyone is on all the time. I don't think that's particularly healthy, and I think that'll actually have a pretty negative impact in terms of like long-term performance of employees and turnover and what have you. But yeah, it's really important to have that first conversation over like what are the expectations of communication and like how do we also maintain them. So yeah, the first thing I would do is talk to your project manager, but also you can talk to other people in your team and be like, how do you deal with this? Do you also feel this pressure to respond?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I personally think it's up to the leaders and the managers to set those expectations. I remember when I first started, again, my manager was like, we don't expect you to reply to emails after 5 or after your workday. We don't expect you to work 40 hours a week. Don't send any emails on the weekends. Like, he was very blatant about it, and he mentioned it repeatedly. And so that allowed me not to have to go there to put myself in this awkward space of like, so what are these expectations? But I think you're right, asking those questions, asking it in that manner of what are the expectations here? This is how I feel. This is where I'm at. I think that's great.
Yeah. And there might be a place where they just haven't had that conversation or, haven't necessarily thought about like implementing this. So, if you talk to them about it, they might be like, oh, wait, yeah, maybe we should have a company-wide policy about like what we should do. That's
exactly a good point too, because so many companies are flipping to remote right now. And it's so important to note that working remotely during a pandemic this year is not the same as working remotely during whatever normal times are anymore. But yeah, it's so important to note that.
Yeah.
So the next question we have here is, how long did it take for you to make time tracking a habit? What tips worked for you personally?
That's a really good one, because for me, before I ever worked for Toggl, I was like really, really into time tracking, because I like in school, in my previous workplace, I realized that 90 chunk thing, and I did a lot of research into productivity at that time, and I was like, okay, I need to like track these 90-minute intervals. But then when I got to Toggl, I was like, I sort of like let it go down the wayside, and then I had to rebuild it as a habit. So a big thing is just having these time tracking reminders for me. So luckily with the product, there are like these desktop, if you have the desktop app, or like there's also a Chrome app, you can set it so that it will remind you within, a specific period of time. So I have it like 9 to 6 or 9 to 5. If I'm not tracking time, it'll send me a reminder being like, hey, why aren't you tracking time? Could you track some time right now? Like, that would be a good idea. So that's a really big thing, because generally it's just like you forget about it. Like, it's just like a completely idle thing. But with those reminders, that's a really big thing. That, and just like understanding the value of your data. Like, as long as you're looking at it and you're like, wait, this is really interesting, you're going to have like a lot more incentive to like continue to track. So yeah, I would recommend like making sure wherever you're spending your most time, whether it's like, in desktop apps or like on web apps, just like installing these applications to remind you. That was like the biggest thing that, helped me make it an actual habit.
Totally. And testing is always is key. I think, like you mentioned earlier, you're 6 years into working remotely, and you're still testing. We're not fixed beings, right? We're kind of fluid and ever changing. So that just makes sense. Our schedules, our routines might change as well, but having those staples, like you're mentioning, will be helpful with that.
For sure.
Let's see here. We have kind of a product question here. How do you describe, organize, and tag entries in Toggl in order to produce reporting that empowers you to make useful change? Cool question.
So for specifics, I actually might need to pass you on. I can get a support person to reach out to you if you present me with your contact info. Because I am not pulling reporting for like a large organization necessarily. Like at Toggl, it will be typically, a team lead or like our CEO or something who would pull that reporting. But for the big thing in terms of like making sure you're doing meaningful stuff on an individual level is the consistency of your project stuff. So you don't want to have like 40 different projects that are like each doing something different. You want to make sure you really sit down and you think about what you're actually putting projects underneath, so that will impact it. Because a lot of people will, they'll get in the app and they'll just like name their first project, and then they'll go off and they'll be like, wait, that wasn't right. I want to do this on a project by project basis. Or they'll be like, oh wait, I want to do it on a type of work basis. They're like, oh, it's like, say you're a writer, they're doing like writing and editing and copy editing and whatever. So it's really depends on what you specifically want to track, whether or not you want to do it on project by project or like general types of work. But whatever you do, consistency is always going to be the biggest thing in terms of any sort of system like this.
Awesome. This is a good question. Do you think remote work prevents building stronger relationships with your coworkers?
Sometimes. I think it depends on your environment. I think there is something to be said for the fact that you can't build relationships remotely the same way you build them in person. Like, I think that's sort of like a baseline kind of thing. But I think you can also set up your remote environment in a way that, also fosters some strong relationship building. It's sort of a weird time now because Toggl would normally take we do sort of like retreats and get-togethers where we actually do meet face by face, even though we're, you know, a globally dispersed company. And I know a lot of people are really missing those, but we also have other things to compensate from that. A lot of people have like sort of fun Slack channels. A kind of weird thing we have is we call it our water cooler chat, but it's actually just a Zoom chat that is open 24 hours a day. So you can just like go in and talk to anyone who's in there. And it's sort of like super low pressure, like no one's really, I don't know, no one's like specifically talking about things, and like it's small enough generally that like you can actually get to know people, versus if you're in these like big get to know you video calls with like 20 other people, you're like, this is an awkward way to talk to people. Like this is not normal at all. But if it's like 3 people, you're like, yeah, this is like, it's a chill way to get to know you. So like I know a lot of people in the company have built a lot of pretty good relationships with coworkers that way. And I would recommend other companies like give that a shot. But it's definitely different.
It probably depends on the company size as well. How big is
Yeah.
the team at Toggl, by the way?
So Toggl, the overall company, I think I don't know, probably like 120 maybe. I'm not
Oh,
quite
wow.
sure. I'm worried
Yeah.
I'm gonna get these numbers wrong. Toggl itself, I think we're Toggl track rather. I think we are 70 something around there.
Right.
So you know, big enough to be big, but not huge and not tiny. So it's definitely a different. Oh, around 78. Cool. Yeah, that would be right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question here. We have a couple left, just being cognizant of the time as well. So Martin here says, thanks for the great presentation, Emma. What differences do you see in working remotely during the pandemic versus normal times, quote unquote?
I would say the biggest thing has to do with socialization, because normally if you work remotely, you're going to be balancing it with these other, you know, social activities. Typically, I'd finish my workday and have plans with someone and immediately go out and meet them and, you know, spend time with people. But because remote work is now also very isolated, you're not able to get that like, you know, social aspect out, and that just makes it a lot harder. And it means that we need to come up with other, you know, strategies to get that socialization. But for me at least, that is the biggest thing. And I've talked to a lot of other people who are like, yeah, that's the big thing for me, switching from pandemic to not pandemic. If you're already working remotely, if you're new to remote, then it's a whole different ball game of like trying to set everything up and like just, you know, adapting to a new way of being remote.
Yeah, I agree with you there. From what I personally have observed, it seems, and it totally depends on the remote culture and the company culture, of course, but I've seen a lot of remote companies kind of treat their employees and team with just more gentleness and more empathy. I think that is really nice to see. Obviously, it's a hard time for everyone. So when you have that kind of leadership that, you know, encourages you to take that extra day off or take a mental health day, or
Yeah.
I think that more of that would be great. And it's just nice to see more of that as well.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we have one last question here. Do you take a nap after lunch? I found that taking a nap after 26 minutes after lunch, and I become more productive and think clearly.
I mean, I have done the nap situation, but unfortunately it's generally to compensate for pretty bad sleep. So I end up just like not not really being in a good place overall sleep-wise. And I'm not a big napper. But I do know a lot of people who, you know, I feel like if you can fall asleep immediately and you can wake up feeling energized, then it's like, yeah, go for it. Like if it makes you feel better, do it. But if you're like me and you spend like 30 minutes trying to fall asleep and then your sleep is pretty, you know, not so great, it's like, it's not, I don't know, it falls in the unsustainable practices kind of realm of remote work.
I'm probably more similar to you. It takes me way longer to fall asleep, and I rarely nap, but when I do, it's almost like a 15-minute, like almost like a meditation nap. And
Mhm.
there's been days where it actually energizes me, which is kind of cool. All right. I think we'll cap it here. Emma, is there anything else you want to add here? Any last words?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, I've got the link there. If anyone has any more questions for me, you can reach out to me either by email or LinkedIn. If you want a copy of this presentation and the notes, you can also reach out to me. I'm totally cool sharing that. And yeah, check out the resources, and yeah, hopefully your remote work is really good from here on in.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We'll be sure to send out this recording hopefully tomorrow, and we'll include the links that Emma has shared here as well. So yeah, thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day and have a